September 19th, 1944. A pale mist stretched across the French countryside near Arracourt, swallowing the horizon in a soft grey haze. The sound of distant engines rumbled through the fog, some American, some German, none visible. Inside one of the Shermans of the 37th Tank Battalion, First Lieutenant Merwin Men steadied himself against the cold steel of his turret. His gunner peered through the periscope, scanning the landscape that seemed to vanish into nothing. Every shadow looked like a panther waiting to strike. The men of the 37th had been warned. The German Panther was no ordinary foe. Its thick, sloped armour had made a mockery of Allied shells since Normandy. Its 75mm gun could tear open a Sherman from more than a mile away. Crews whispered that it was hopeless to face one head-on. Yet somewhere in the ammunition rack of Men's tank lay 6 rounds that would defy that assumption. 6 pieces of experimental ordnance that carried the potential to change the course of armoured warfare. Each of these new shells was called the M93 high-velocity armour-piercing round, or HVAP. At its heart was a tungsten carbide core, a dense, almost indestructible metal harder than anything the Germans could match in large quantities by 1944. These rounds had the power to make even a medium Sherman a mortal threat to a Panther. No one in that fog-shrouded field yet realized that those 6 pieces of tungsten would ignite a chain of events reshaping how both armies thought about tanks, technology, and the psychology of survival. In early 1944, the United States Army faced an armoured dilemma. The M4 Sherman, long considered a dependable mainstay, was showing its age. It had served faithfully across North Africa and Italy. But now the German army was fielding a new generation of tanks. The Panther, born from Germany's desperate lessons on the Eastern Front, combined firepower, mobility, and protection in a package that outclassed anything the Allies had. Its 75mm KWK 42-gun fired shells so fast they could pierce Allied armour long before the Shermans were close enough to reply. Its sloped glacis plate, 80mm thick and angled at 55 degrees, gave it an effective armour resistance of around 140mm. To an American gunner staring through his sights, the Panther's front was practically untouchable. When American intelligence first learned of the Panther's design, they dismissed it as too advanced to exist in meaningful numbers. Reports before D-Day predicted only a handful would appear in Normandy. But by June 1944, nearly 40% of German tanks in France were Panthers. What was supposed to be an occasional threat had become the backbone of Hitler's armoured divisions. The result was devastating. Sherman crews who faced Panthers discovered their shells bouncing harmlessly off the sloped armour. Even the upgraded 76mm gun that began arriving in July struggled to achieve meaningful penetrations from the front. Against the Panther's thick glacis plate, the 76mm standard M62 armour-piercing round was nearly useless. The physics were unforgiving. The shell simply didn't carry enough velocity to bite into that armour. The Sherman, once the hunter, was now the hunted. General Eisenhower himself was infuriated when reports reached his headquarters. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out?" he demanded. "I thought it was supposed to be the wonder gun of the war." The hard truth was undeniable. The Allies had underestimated the technical leap Germany had made. The problem was not the gun itself, but the ammunition it fired. American ordnance engineers had pushed for a redesign as early as 1943, but bureaucracy and overconfidence slowed progress. The 76mm gun had finally entered mass production, yet it fired the same type of steel-cored shells that had already proven inadequate. It was like giving a new rifle the same old bullets and expecting a miracle. The breakthrough began not on the battlefield, but in the laboratories and testing grounds of the United States. Engineers and metallurgists in the Ordnance Department recognized that the answer didn't lie in brute force, it lay in physics. If a shell couldn't rely on sheer size, it would have to rely on speed and density. What they developed was revolutionary for its time: the high-velocity armor-piercing round, or HVAP. Officially designated the T4, later standardized as the M93, this new shell was unlike anything American tankers had fired before. Instead of a solid steel penetrator, the M93 used a small but incredibly dense tungsten carbide core. Around it was a lightweight aluminum alloy body and a pointed ballistic cap. This combination allowed the shell to be much lighter overall, enabling higher muzzle velocities while concentrating nearly all its energy into the tungsten core. When fired from the 76mm M1 gun, the M93 achieved a muzzle velocity of over 1,030 meters per second, nearly 250 meters faster than the standard round. That increase in speed translated into raw penetrating power. At 1,000 yards, the M93 could drive through 160 millimeters of armor at a shallow impact angle. Against the Panther's gun mantlet, that meant for the first time American crews had a fighting chance. Still, the ammunition was in short supply. Tungsten carbide was an industrial treasure, vital not only for ammunition but for manufacturing itself. Machine tools, cutting blades, and armor hardeners all relied on it. Before the war, most of the world's tungsten came from China, but wartime disruption and global demand had stretched supply thin. Each M93 round required nearly a kilogram of tungsten carbide. With thousands of tanks in the field, there simply wasn't enough metal to go around. By the summer of 1944, production of HVAP rounds barely met test requirements. Only small shipments reached the front. In August, perhaps 1,000 rounds were produced. In September, another 1,000. By the end of the year, monthly output had increased to several thousand, but it was still far below what the armored forces needed. On average, a Sherman might receive 5 HVAP rounds, sometimes fewer. The message to crews was clear: make every shot count. In Normandy, Sherman crews learned through blood that frontal assaults against Panthers were suicide. The standard 75mm gun couldn't hurt them, and even the 76mm struggled except at point-blank range. Tankers quickly learned to aim for the Panther's flanks or its gun mantlet. Others resorted to calling in artillery or air support instead of engaging directly. The Panther's gun could destroy a Sherman from over 2 kilometers away, so distance favored the Germans. By July, frustration spread through the ranks. General Omar Bradley ordered the immediate deployment of all available 76mm Shermans to the front, hoping to narrow the firepower gap. When Operation Cobra launched later that month, the first of these new tanks went into combat. The improvement was real, but limited. The 76mm gun could now destroy most German armor, but the Panther remained stubbornly resistant to anything but the most favorable hits. Tank crews began to lose faith in their equipment. They joked grimly that their Shermans lit up like Ronsons, the American cigarette lighters that always ignited on the first try. Though later analysis proved this reputation exaggerated, the fear was real. Facing an enemy you could not kill frontally had a psychological toll all its own. It was precisely that fear, the creeping sense of inferiority, that made the arrival of the HVAP rounds so powerful. Crews suddenly had something new, something secret, something that might just level the field. For the first time since D-Day, they had reason to believe that a Panther could be destroyed from the front. By September 1944, American forces were pushing deep into northeastern France. General Patton's Third Army had raced across the countryside, its armoured columns stretching supply lines to the breaking point. The 4th Armoured Division, one of Patton's elite units, had seized ground near the Moselle River and established a precarious foothold. The Germans, desperate to halt the advance, counterattacked with the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel. Among the units thrown into the fight were the newly formed 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, each equipped primarily with Panthers fresh from the factory. Their crews were green, many having trained for only a few weeks, but the tanks themselves were formidable. On paper, the Germans outmatched the Americans 3-1. The town of Arracourt became the focal point of the coming battle, a quiet collection of farmhouses and hedgerows that would soon witness one of the largest armoured clashes fought by American forces in Europe. On the night of September 18th, dense fog rolled in. It blanketed the fields in a grey veil so thick that even nearby vehicles vanished from sight. At dawn, the German Panthers began to move. Without proper reconnaissance, they advanced blindly toward the American positions, believing they could crush Patton's bridgehead in a single blow. The 37th Tank Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, had prepared for such an attack. The fog that hindered the Germans worked in the Americans' favour. Hidden behind hedgerows and low ridges, the Shermans waited. In C Company, Captain Kenneth Lamison briefed his crews before sunrise. Each Sherman had been issued a handful of HVAP rounds, 6, maybe fewer. The men had been told exactly how to use them. Aim for the mantlet or turret face, never waste them on a bad shot. When a Panther appeared through the fog, they were to fire fast and fire true. Around 8 a.m., the first silhouettes emerged. A Panther loomed out of the mist barely 70 meters away. Its gun was still searching when the Sherman fired. The HVAP round streaked across the short distance and slammed into the Panther's mantlet. The tungsten core punched clean through, igniting the ammunition inside. The turret lifted from the blast. 2 more Panthers appeared moments later and met the same fate. In less than a minute, the threat was gone. Across the sector, similar ambushes unfolded. Panthers advanced in tight formations, their commanders unaware of the Americans lying in wait. Without reconnaissance and blinded by fog, they drove straight into kill zones. Hellcat tank destroyers joined the fight, their 76mm guns also armed with HVAP. The results were devastating. German armour that should have dominated the field was cut to pieces in confused, short-range firefights. As the morning wore on and the fog lifted, American artillery joined in. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 405th Fighter Group swooped down through gaps in the clouds, attacking German tanks and columns caught in the open. By noon, what had begun as a German counter-offensive had turned into a rout. When the smoke cleared, the Americans counted their losses: 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers destroyed. The Germans had lost more than 3 times that number, including dozens of Panthers. The Battle of Arracourt had turned what was supposed to be a German show of force into a humiliating defeat. But beyond the wreckage, something more important had shifted. The myth of the Panther's invulnerability was gone. American crews who had once dreaded meeting the big German tanks now knew they could win. The Battle of Arracourt lasted from September 18th to the 29th, 1944, and by its end it had destroyed not just dozens of German tanks, but also one of the central illusions of German armoured superiority. The Panther, once feared as an untouchable titan, had proven beatable. The fog of Lorraine had become more than a meteorological accident. It was a veil that revealed a new balance in armoured warfare. For the Germans, the shock was immense. Reports from the 113th Panzer Brigade were contradictory and confused. Commanders could not understand how Shermans were destroying Panthers from the front. Some claimed the Americans must have introduced a new tank, perhaps one armed with a 90mm gun. Others insisted that British Firefly Shermans, equipped with the 17-pounder gun, must have been operating under American command. Few could believe that ordinary M4s had done the job. The truth was worse. The Americans hadn't built a new tank at all. They had built a new kind of ammunition. The Panther's psychological advantage, carefully cultivated through training and propaganda, evaporated overnight. Since its introduction in 1943, the Panther had been sold to its crews as a near-invincible machine. Its long, sleek barrel, wide tracks, and deadly front armour gave it an aura of superiority. German training manuals instructed tankers that as long as they faced the enemy directly, no Allied gun could pierce their frontal plate. Confidence in the machine became as much a weapon as the gun it carried. But at Arracourt, reality reasserted itself. Dozens of Panthers were destroyed not by secret Allied tanks or hidden ambush guns, but by Shermans firing American-made tungsten shells. Survivors told stories of shells striking their mantlets and punching clean through, detonating ammunition that should have been safe. When these accounts filtered back through the ranks, something changed in the mindset of Germany's panzer forces. If the Panther could be killed frontally, then no position was truly safe. And once tank crews began to believe that, their confidence faltered. They became cautious where once they were aggressive. They hesitated where once they charged. The Americans, meanwhile, felt the opposite. For months, they had faced the psychological weight of knowing that German tanks could destroy them before they even entered effective range. Now, with HVAP ammunition in their racks, they knew they could fight back and win. Behind that shift in confidence lay one of the most complex industrial challenges of the war: tungsten. Tungsten carbide, the dense heart of every M93 HVAP shell, was among the rarest and most valuable materials of the conflict. Before 1939, China produced more than a third of the world's tungsten, mined largely in the southern provinces of Hunan and Jiangxi. When Japan invaded China, that supply became unreliable. The United States scrambled to secure new sources from South America and the western states of Colorado, Nevada, and California, but the quantities were small. Tungsten wasn't just for tank shells. It was essential for machine tools that shaped aircraft engines, for the tips of drills that cut through armor plating, and for the hardened steel dies used in ammunition factories. Every piece of tungsten diverted to HVAP meant less for something else critical. American industry was vast, but not infinite. By the late summer of 1944, ordnance officers had to make hard choices. The Army decided that only a limited number of HVAP rounds could be sent overseas each month. The bulk went to tank destroyer units, whose sole purpose was to fight enemy armor. Regular Sherman battalions received only small allocations. The result was a strange paradox: a weapon that could shift the battlefield, but was too rare to fully change the war. The tungsten problem mirrored the broader tension of Allied production: immense capacity limited only by the raw materials of the planet itself. Even so, by the end of 1944, American factories had produced over 30,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition. It wasn't enough to supply every tank, but it was enough to make an impact wherever it appeared. For the men who fought in those tanks, the HVAP was more than a new type of shell. It was a symbol of hope. Tank crews are, above all, realists. They know what works and what doesn't. When the early 76mm rounds bounced off Panthers like pebbles on a river, morale sank. But when HVAP entered the picture, stories began to circulate. Stories of Shermans knocking out Panthers from the front, of tungsten shells punching through armor thought to be impregnable. Even crews who never received HVAP benefited from its existence. Just knowing that somewhere out there American tanks had the power to kill Panthers gave them courage. That belief was contagious. In war, psychology and physics are always intertwined, but the limitations were real. The tungsten core, though extremely hard, was also brittle. At lower velocities, such as long-range shots or hits on sharply angled surfaces, it could shatter on impact. That meant the HVAP was most effective at short to medium ranges and against relatively flat surfaces, like the Panther's mantlet or turret face. The heavily sloped glacis plate on the front of the Panther could still deflect even a tungsten penetrator if struck at the wrong angle. Crews learned these lessons quickly, often through experience paid for in blood. HVAP was a tool, not a miracle. Used wisely, it could change the outcome of a battle. Used carelessly, it was just another expensive shell bouncing off German armour. As autumn turned to winter, the war changed again. In December 1944, the German army launched its final major offensive on the Western Front, the Battle of the Bulge. Once more, Panthers and Tiger IIs rolled forward in large numbers. Once more, American Shermans met them in snow-covered villages and forests. This time, however, the Americans fought with hard-earned knowledge and, in some cases, precious HVAP rounds. But supply lines were stretched thin, and the same tungsten scarcity that had haunted production all year became even worse in the chaos of the winter fighting. Many units went into the Ardennes with only a handful of HVAP shells, and some had none at all. The weather was the great equalizer. Dense fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft, stripping away one of the Americans' biggest advantages. Tank battles once again came down to close-quarters ambushes, gunnery skill, and nerve. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the limitations of HVAP were made painfully clear. Crews who used it at long range often watched their tungsten cores shatter against sloped armour. Others found that, against the massive Tiger II, even HVAP could not guarantee penetration. But when used within its effective range, it was still deadly. Many Panther crews learned the hard way that what had been true in Normandy was no longer true in the winter of 1944. Yet in truth, the Battle of the Bulge was decided not by tungsten, but by logistics. German fuel shortages and overstretched supply lines doomed the offensive. Even their best tanks could not move without gasoline. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht's panzer force was bleeding out. Its machines were powerful, but its industry and infrastructure were collapsing. The Panther's reign as the terror of Allied tankers was ending, not because it was obsolete, but because the world that had built it was disintegrating. Germany had developed its own tungsten-core ammunition years earlier. The Panzer Grenadier 40, a small-caliber, high-velocity armour-piercing round, had shown promise early in the war. But German tungsten reserves were minuscule, and by 1944 the material was too precious to waste on tank shells. It was needed for manufacturing machine tools and aircraft engines. While American engineers were experimenting with tungsten rounds for the 76mm and 3-inch guns, German factories were rationing their supply to critical industries. Sweden, one of the few neutral countries still exporting tungsten to Germany, had drastically reduced shipments as Allied bombing and naval blockades tightened their grip. By late 1944, German tankers had no equivalent to the American HVAP. They fought with standard steel-cored ammunition, powerful enough against most Allied tanks, but offering no new advantage. The war of innovation that Germany had once led was now being won by American industry. This industrial contrast explains much of what happened in the last year of the war. Germany built excellent tanks, but in limited numbers. The Allies built good tanks in overwhelming quantities. For every Panther that rolled off a German assembly line, American factories turned out 8 Shermans. That ratio alone would have been decisive. Add to it a constant flow of improved ammunition, spare parts, and fuel, and the outcome became inevitable. The Panther was a masterpiece of design and a tragedy of strategy, a tank that could dominate in theory but not sustain itself in reality. The Sherman was the opposite, simple, reliable, and adaptable. It could evolve. And when HVAP entered its ammunition racks, it proved that adaptability mattered more than raw specifications. After the war, historians and ordnance experts studied the battlefields of Lorraine and the shattered hulks of Panthers left behind. Many of the wrecks bore the telltale signs of HVAP strikes, small, clean entry holes through the mantlet, often accompanied by catastrophic internal explosions. Others showed glancing hits where tungsten penetrators had shattered or ricocheted. The data confirmed what the soldiers had learned through experience. HVAP was deadly but situational. Against flat armor at short ranges, it could tear through steel that standard rounds could never breach. Against heavy slopes or long distances, it lost its edge. The Panther's glacis remained mostly immune, but the turret, mantelet, and side plates were vulnerable. The American Ordnance Department concluded that the M93 had been a success. Not perfect, but vital. Without it, battles like Arracourt might have ended very differently. More importantly, the round's psychological impact had been immense. It restored faith in the Sherman and gave American crews a renewed sense of agency in a war that often felt like a contest of machines rather than men. When the Korean War began in 1950, the lessons of 1944 returned to relevance. Once again, the M4 Sherman went to war, this time facing Soviet-built T-3485s in the hills of Korea. And this time, the tungsten problem was gone. American industry had vast peacetime reserves of the metal, and HVAP ammunition was produced in abundance. Sherman crews in Korea discovered that their 76mm guns, firing HVAP, could easily penetrate the T-34's armor at normal combat ranges. The same ammunition that had been scarce in Europe now poured freely from American depots. The result was a vindication of the technology, and a reminder of how much the outcome of a war can hinge on supply chains as much as science. HVAP's legacy didn't end with the M4 Sherman. The principles behind its design, high velocity, small profile, and extreme density, became the foundation for all modern tank ammunition. The tungsten core evolved into long, narrow penetrators stabilized by fins and launched from sabot casings. These new rounds, known as APFSDS, armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot, followed the same physics the M93 had first proven in 1944. Concentrate all your kinetic energy into the smallest possible point and let speed do the rest. Today, every major tank in the world, from the American Abrams to the German Leopard and the Russian T-90, owes part of its lethality to that wartime experiment in tungsten. The materials and designs have changed, but the principle remains identical. The story of the M93 HVAP round is not just about metallurgy or ballistics, it is about adaptability. The Sherman never became the best tank of the war by any technical standard, but it became good enough and it became available in numbers that mattered. The HVAP turned that good enough into something formidable. Arracourt proved that innovation doesn't always mean starting from scratch. Sometimes it means finding a smarter way to use what you already have. The Americans didn't need a new tank to defeat the Panther. They needed the right tool in the hands of the right crews, supported by an industrial machine that could sustain the fight. For the men who fired those first HVAP rounds through the fog of Lorraine, it wasn't theory or history, it was survival. Each tungsten core represented a chance to live through another day. Each destroyed Panther was proof that courage, science, and production could stand against one of the most advanced weapons of the age. When the guns fell silent in 1945 and Europe began to rebuild, the wrecks of Shermans and Panthers alike rusted quietly in the fields they had fought for. Yet in those broken hulls lay the evidence of a lesson that would echo into the future. No tank is invincible, no army undefeatable, and no myth unbreakable. On September 19, 1944, as the fog lifted over Arracourt and the smoke of burning Panthers curled into the sky, the balance of fear on the Western Front shifted. It shifted not because of a new tank, but because of a few pounds of tungsten carbide forged in American factories and fired by crews who refused to surrender. Those 6 rounds inside Lieutenant Men's Sherman did not win the war, but they proved something far more enduring. They proved that knowledge and innovation, when paired with courage, can turn even the simplest machine into a legend. When the smoke cleared over Arracourt and the burned-out Panthers lay silent in the mist, few of the men fighting there realized they had just witnessed a turning point. The victory of the 4th Armoured Division was not a matter of numbers alone, nor even tactics. It was a victory of adaptation. From the moment the first tungsten-cored shell punched through a German mantlet, a new era of warfare had begun, one in which science, industry, and morale would shape the outcome as much as courage and steel. The lessons learned in those fog-shrouded fields rippled outward through every level of the American war machine. Commanders, engineers, and policymakers began to grasp that technology was not a static advantage. It was a living competition, one measured in days, not decades. Every battle became an experiment, and every experiment demanded a faster answer. By late 1944, tank combat was as much psychological as mechanical. For the Germans, who had once taken pride in the aura of invulnerability that surrounded their armour, the revelation that American guns could now pierce it was devastating. Reports from the front revealed that Panther crews became increasingly hesitant to advance without infantry support or artillery preparation. They began to dig in, using their tanks as stationary strongpoints rather than offensive weapons. The Luftwaffe's decline and the loss of German reconnaissance aircraft compounded this problem. Without clear intelligence, Panther crews often entered combat blind, unsure where the Americans were waiting or whether their own armour could withstand another encounter with tungsten-tipped shells. For the Americans, the effect was the opposite. The existence of HVAP, even in limited quantities, broke the mental barrier that had haunted Sherman crews since Normandy. The tank that had once seemed helpless against the Panther could now strike back. The mere belief that victory was possible gave rise to new aggressiveness, new confidence, and renewed tactical creativity. Historians often underestimate the importance of morale in armoured warfare. A tank, no matter how well built, is only as effective as the men inside it. The crews who fought through 1944 and 1945 did so with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and grim determination. But when they saw that even the most formidable enemy armour could be destroyed, something shifted. Fear became focus, doubt became resolve. The German army could design brilliant machines, but America could mass-produce innovation faster than Germany could react. This became the central story of the war's final year. By the spring of 1945, American industry had achieved something Germany could no longer dream of: synchronization. The Ordnance Department worked hand in hand with private manufacturers, ensuring that every tank improvement, every ammunition upgrade, flowed quickly from the drawing board to the battlefield. Factories that once built car parts were now turning out HVAP rounds by the thousands. Rail lines carried them across the country to ports, where Liberty ships transported them to Europe. Within months, ammunition that had been experimental in the summer of 1944 was now standard issue for tank destroyer battalions and select armoured units. Meanwhile, Germany's factories were crumbling under Allied bombing. Key plants in Kassel, Nuremberg, and Vienna lay in ruins. Even when Panthers were produced, shortages of fuel, spare parts, and trained crews rendered many of them useless. In the final months of the war, German units abandoned tanks not because they were destroyed, but because they could not move. It was a brutal demonstration of a truth the Americans had mastered. A weapon's power is measured not only in what it can do, but in how many can be supplied and sustained. A single Panther might outgun a single Sherman, but a dozen Shermans supported by endless fuel, artillery, and ammunition could win the day. The HVAP round became a symbol of this philosophy, proof that American industry could outthink and outbuild even the most advanced enemy designs. By early 1945, the Panther was no longer the terror it had been in 1943. On the Eastern Front, Soviet T-3485s, IS-2s, and self-propelled guns battered it relentlessly. On the Western Front, Allied tank destroyers, rocket-firing aircraft, and HVAP-equipped Shermans eroded its once fearsome reputation. The Panther remained a formidable weapon, but its time had passed. Germany could not repair or replace its losses quickly enough, and its new tanks, like the Tiger II, were so heavy and fuel-hungry that they became burdens rather than assets. When American forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they did so with confidence. The lessons of Arracourt had spread through the armoured corps. Crews no longer avoided frontal engagements out of habit. They understood their equipment, their ammunition, and their limitations. They had learned how to win, not through blind courage, but through the intelligent application of firepower and manoeuvre. By the time Germany surrendered in May, the Panther had lost the war of perception. It was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. German officers who survived the war studied the defeat carefully. In post-war interrogations, many cited the discovery of American tungsten ammunition as one of the most troubling surprises of the conflict. They admitted that their own tungsten-core shells had been superior in concept, but impossible to produce in useful quantities. One German ordnance engineer reportedly remarked that the Americans had accomplished what Germany could not. They solved the problem of scarcity by overwhelming it. Captured documents revealed that German engineers had analysed HVAP projectiles recovered from wrecked tanks. They marvelled at the efficient design, the use of a lightweight carrier body to reduce overall weight, and the ingenious way it conserved scarce tungsten while maintaining extreme velocity. It was, they admitted, a practical masterpiece of industrial engineering. The defeat at Arracourt and similar battles in 1944 to 45 became cautionary tales within the emerging Bundeswehr of post-war West Germany. When German tank design resumed in the 1950s, it emphasized not only armor and firepower, but also ammunition quality and crew training. The Leopard 1 and later Leopard 2 tanks reflected that philosophy, pairing mobility and sophisticated ammunition with precision optics and advanced targeting systems. The ghosts of Lorraine lingered in every blueprint. The M93 HVAP round had proven a single concept beyond doubt. Density and velocity could compensate for size. This simple truth reshaped the next 70 years of tank design. In the decades after the war, every major military power adopted armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds, descendants of the tungsten shells first tested in 1944. The materials evolved from tungsten carbide to depleted uranium, but the principle remained identical. A small, dense penetrator, traveling at extreme velocity, could punch through armor far thicker than its own diameter. The Abrams tank's M829 series, the British L-27 Chobs, and modern Russian Svinets rounds all follow the lineage of the M93. The tungsten revolution of 1944 never truly ended, it simply refined itself. Even in an age of reactive armor, composite plates, and electronic warfare, the fundamentals of penetration physics remain rooted in the same wartime discoveries. The high-velocity shell that once tore through a Panther's mantlet lives on in modern tank guns, its essence unchanged. The men who fought with the M93 never saw themselves as part of a technological revolution. For them, it was simpler than that. Each shell was a chance to survive. Each penetration was one less Panther waiting to ambush them tomorrow. Many veterans of the 37th Tank Battalion would go on to long careers in the post-war army. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, whose leadership at Arracourt became legendary. Decades later, his name would adorn America's most advanced tank, the M1 Abrams. In that machine, equipped with a 120mm smoothbore gun firing depleted uranium penetrators, the lineage of the HVAP shell found its modern form. Abrams himself understood what Arracourt had proven. The power of a tank lies not in its armor or gun alone, but in the people who fight it and the logistics that sustain it. The M1 that bears his name was designed around those very principles: speed, coordination, and the ability to exploit every technological advantage available. The story of the M93 HVAP is also the story of how nations adapt under pressure. In 1944, American armored forces were not the strongest, nor their tanks the most advanced. But they had something their enemies lacked: flexibility. When their weapons failed, they did not surrender to despair. They looked for solutions. They sought out better materials, better manufacturing methods, and better ways to train their men. In contrast, Germany, constrained by ideology, scarcity, and inflexible command, could not evolve as quickly. Its engineers built masterpieces, but its factories could not keep up. By the time the Panther reached its peak, it was already outnumbered, outproduced, and outmaneuvered. Arracourt, therefore, stands not only as a victory of one side's tactics over another, but as a testament to the power of industrial democracy. It showed that an open system, capable of learning and innovating rapidly, could outfight even the most advanced authoritarian war machine. The irony of HVAP is that its greatest success came after the war it was built for had already ended. During the Korean War, the tungsten shortage was gone, and the round was finally available in the quantities its designers had always intended. Sherman crews found that their 76mm guns, now firing a steady diet of HVAP, could destroy Soviet-made T-34-85s with ease. What had been a rare and precious commodity in France was now abundant in Asia. This belated vindication underscored a truth of wartime innovation. Sometimes the perfect weapon arrives just a little too late. But even if HVAP didn't win World War II by itself, it changed the trajectory of how wars would be fought thereafter. By the time peace returned to Europe, the factories that had produced HVAP rounds shut down or converted to civilian use. But the knowledge remained. Military scientists studied the M93 for years, using its data to refine post-war ammunition for the emerging Cold War. Tungsten itself became a strategic material, stockpiled and monitored, its importance recognized by every industrialized nation. In 1944, a single Sherman tank might carry just 6 tungsten-cored rounds, barely enough for one engagement. Yet those 6 rounds carried the hopes of an army and the lessons of a generation. They proved that in warfare no advantage is permanent and no weakness beyond redemption. The story of the M93 is not about a shell alone. It is about ingenuity in the face of failure, persistence in the shadow of fear, and the unbreakable link between science and survival. It is about men like Lieutenant Men, who gripped the rim of his turret and faced the fog with no promise except the one forged in tungsten and faith. On that September morning in 1944, as the fields of Lorraine disappeared into smoke and steel, 6 rounds whispered a truth that would echo for decades. No armor is invincible, no weapon eternal, and no battle decided until the last round is fired. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe.